So I'm here to talk to you today about content moderation workflows for Drupal 8. I'll just start off with the introduction. My name is Suzanne Dergacheva. I work at Evolving Web here in Montreal, and I do a lot of different things at Evolving Web, one of which is run our training program. For those of you who don't know Evolving Web, we're a Drupal development shop. We've been around for about 10 years, and we work on projects for all different types of clients in different spaces: government, universities, healthcare, etc. And so the talk that I'm going to be bringing you today is about content moderation, and specifically the content moderation module for Drupal 8, but also just some general ideas about what a content moderation workflow can and should look like. So some advice to give us guidance when we're designing these things. So just to give me an idea, so I'm trying to see who you are. How many of you are like content people? Like you're actually working with content on sites? Okay. And how many of you are site builders, like you're configuring a site? And who are the rest of you? You're developers?
Yep.
No.
I'm a content person.
A content person. So we'll be moderating your contentness today. Okay, great. So thanks all for coming. So when I think about content moderation, and I think about like what does Drupal do in terms of moderating content out of the box, by default, it's really simple. By default, like what we've been doing for Drupal in years, what Drupal's done out of the box for years, is just a simple toggle on and off. Is the content published? Is it not published? And so this is something that we sometimes want to customize. Sometimes we feel like we should customize it. We want something more advanced. But a lot of the time, you should be striving for something simpler. So keep in mind, if all you need is a simple publish button, that's what Drupal already does without any content moderation tools, and maybe that's enough. So maybe all we need is just this one publish button, which is what we get out of the box without turning anything on. That being said, so we've heard of content moderation. So how many of you have used the content moderation module for Drupal 8? A couple of you? Okay, great. So content moderation, if you turn on this module, and this module is new in the last minor release of Drupal. It's newly released as a full module that's suggested to be used. So if we look at what it does, it's basically doing three things. First of all, and the first thing I think is actually the most interesting in a way, the most useful for the most number of sites. The first thing that we have with this module is the ability to create drafts. So that's something that maybe you think you can do with just a publish button, because you can have content that's unpublished. But in fact, just a simple publish button doesn't give you really the ability to have drafts, because once content is published, there's no way to create another draft of that content that's unpublished. So if you don't have content moderation turned on, as soon as content is published, any change you make to it will be published, unless you unpublish the whole thing. So if you think about the limitations of that, like it's pretty limiting. You publish the About Us page for your website the day you launch your website. You're not going to take that page offline when you want to make changes to it. You're going to leave it published. And so if somebody wants to make a new draft and decides to make some content changes, they're automatically going to be live on the site. And so in the past, what I've seen people do is they end up taking that draft state of the content offline. So people will actually have like maybe a Word document or a Google Doc or something like that, where they're making updates to their About Us page, and then they do all their editing and their drafting offline, and then they put it back online, which is reasonable. But it means that that whole process of drafting content gets taken out of Drupal. So now with content moderation, we can just do that in Drupal. You can create new drafts, and then once a draft is ready, you can publish it. The second thing content moderation does is it allows us to have content states. beyond just published and unpublished. So beyond just published, unpublished, and then this idea of having things flagged as drafts, we can also have other states like needs review, like archived, or even more if you need more for your workflow. So you can decide what your workflow should be, and you can set up the states as the site builder. The third thing that we have is we can take this workflow, this set of states that we've created, and we can allow the users to change the state. So we can say, okay, people can move something from draft to needs review, and these are called transitions. And then we can decide who can do that and what kind of content they can do it to. So you can build up this workflow with different states, and then you can actually build out a workflow with that in which things can change from state to state, and you can control who can do it. So content moderation has all these features, and you can set up your editing workflow. You can set it up just as, it can be as simple as just having it something that's draft and something that's published, or you can add these additional states. So if we actually look at what the workflow is like, if we just apply the workflow that comes with content moderation out of the box, we have this setup where content starts off as a draft, and this is very typical, right? Like usually a moderation workflow, you're going to have a draft to begin with. Then you transition that content from draft to published. So once you're ready, you hit that publish button, or you select the publish state. And then we have another transition to move content from published to archived once the content is maybe stale. So if you were at Danielle's session yesterday about content auditing, she was talking all about how we should clean up content. So that archival state is also built into the default workflow, which I kind of like how that's highlighted there, just out of the box with content moderation. So we sometimes think about content moderation as being this kind of linear thing. Yeah, like it starts off as a draft, you publish content, eventually it gets archived, easy, right? But actually workflows are always more complicated than that, because you publish something and then you go back and you make a draft, or you publish something and then it gets archived and then you unarchive it because it gets refreshed. So you can have a workflow that's much more dynamic than this, that has lots of transitions that allow us to flip between states. So actually all of these things can be transitions, all of these different arrows. And so a content publication workflow, you can think of it as a line, you could think of it as a circle, or you can just think of it as a series of states that we move between. And just keep in mind, each of these transitions is something in Drupal that has a permission. So you as if you're a content editor, you might just have permission to move things between two of the states. You might never see the other states, or you might never have the option to do some of these transitions. So the workflow maybe is not going to seem as complex to each user. Okay, so we're going to talk about this more in practical terms, how to apply this to content in just a minute. But once we have a workflow established, then you can go and take it and apply it to content. And this is also a really nice thing about content moderation, is that it's not just like you have one workflow that you have to use for all your content. You can actually apply this workflow to different content types. And so you can say, take this workflow and say this applies to all the articles on the site, but not to any of the other content. So you might have some content types that are being managed by more senior users or more advanced users who don't need that workflow. And you might have some content types where you don't really need to have drafts. And so you can take the workflow and just apply it to the content types that it makes sense for. And you could do that on a per bundle basis, so per content type, and also for blocks, you can use that. So if we're looking at how to set this up, if you actually turn on the module, you have all this configuration. you have a page where you can create the states, you can create the transitions, and you can apply the workflow to different bundles of content. And there's a nice page if you're trying to remember how to do this later. I'm going to do a demo, but if you try and remember how to do this later, there's documentation on Drupal.org about how to configure all of this, which is very nice. It's basically all on one page under configuration workflows. So before we jump into the demo, what I really want you what I want to pause and just think about is when you're planning your content moderation workflow, you want to be trying to build the simplest workflow possible. So oftentimes clients get really excited and they're like, oh, we have this tool for making content moderation workflow. So we can have all these different types of editors and they can improve each other's content and it's going to be great. We're going to have this amazing new workflow. And maybe it's a workflow that didn't exist before when they were doing things in Word and Google Docs. Because if you think about it, like usually in Word and Google Docs, I mean, you can have suggestions and people can approve suggestions, but it's not really an advanced workflow using those tools. It's pretty freeform. So when you're implementing this, I would suggest that you try and implement the simplest possible workflow. And you can always make the workflow more complicated later. Keep that in mind. So as soon as you add a lot of states, it's actually kind of hard to transition back into something simpler, because then you have to take all the content that's in the needs final approval state and do something with it. So it's kind of easier to just start off with a simple workflow, and then if you find that you need more complexity, you can add that in. You can add that in post-launch. Okay, so I'm going to put the site on the screen, and we're going to actually walk through what it's like to implement this and see some of these content moderation features in action. So the only module we need for today, I'll talk about some other extra modules you can use at the end, but the only module we need for today is the content moderation module. So sorry, I went right past it. Content moderation in core, and I'm just going to turn that on. Sorry? Oh, I'm sorry, it's not actually on the screen. Thank you, Mark. Okay, let's see. Can you see it now? Why am I just gonna